Heath History Forum. It's a really great pleasure to greet you this Saturday afternoon. It's a great delight to be able to host one of our own members of the committee and a local historian, Dr. Emily O'Gorman, who is a dear friend and wondrous colleague. Emily is an environmental historian based at Macquarie University when she's allowed to leave the house. Her research is primarily concerned with contested knowledges within broader cultural framings of authority, expertise and landscapes. This has been supported by nationally competitive research grants, including a writing fellowship at the Rachel Carson Centre in Munich. And she's author of A Flood Country, an environmental history of the Murray-Darling Basin, and this excellent book, which everyone should seek to purchase as soon as possible, Wetlands in a Dry Land, More Than Human Histories of Australia's Murray-Darling Basin, which is largely what Emily's going to talk about today. She's co-edited a couple of other books on climate science and colonisation and ecoculture in the British Empire. And she is the founding associate editor of the journal Environmental Humanities, which has been a very important vehicle growing her field. And currently, Emily is convener of the Australian and Aotearoa New Zealand Environmental History Network, and it is a wonderful privilege to host you today here, Emily. Thank you so much for doing it.
Thanks so much, Hannah. And to start with, I'd like to acknowledge that here in the Blue Mountains, we're on the country of Darug and Gundungurra people, and I want to pay my respects to elders past and present. And of course, the Blue Mountains is part of a bigger mountain range in eastern Australia, from which water runs into the rivers of the Murray-Darling Basin, which is the focus of my recent book, which Hannah kindly held up, and also the focus of this talk. So I'd like to acknowledge that the basin is comprised of the country of more than 40 different Aboriginal groups, and I pay my respects to elders past and present. It's great to be speaking to you all, and thank you so much for coming along, and thank you for your interest in this topic. So for this talk, I thought I'd start with an outline of my recent book, Wetlands in a Dry Land, and then focus on a specific case for the second half. The book, titled Wetlands in a Dry Land, More Than Human Histories of Australia's Murray-Darling Basin, was published in July this year with University of Washington Press. At its core, it's a history of wetlands within this particular river system in Australia, the Murray-Darling Basin. It aims to show what this region can contribute to national and international discussions about both history, including ways of doing history, and water and wetlands in a time of environmental crises. I've worked with and within this river system for a really long time now, all up more than 15 years. It's a remarkable place with a rich diversity of landscapes and people. It's also a region that is rich in environmental contestations, many of which happen between multiple scales, from the international to the quite local. The Murray-Darling Basin is a massive river system. It covers a seventh of Australia. It crosses 4 states and the Australian Capital Territory. It is often referred to as the nation's food bowl, and has been a site of significant irrigation schemes and dam construction. Today, the basin poses environmental management challenges at a range of scales. Most prominently, these challenges centre on competing views over agricultural water diversion from rivers and wetlands for farming, the channelization of rivers, and the construction of irrigation infrastructures, as well as Aboriginal people's access to water for a range of reasons, including spiritual, cultural, and economic values and activities. These contemporary debates and physical landscapes have been shaped by past approaches to wetlands, including local uses such as hunting, fishing, and farming, that have both created bonds with particular wetlands and altered them. The basin and its history also raise internationally pressing considerations of water scarcity that are especially crucial in the context of climate change. The book focuses on the 20th century as a period of significant losses of wetlands, both in the basin and around the world, due to drainage for agriculture and other forms of development, disease control, and water diversion for irrigation. Ecologists currently estimate that up to 87% of the world's wetlands have disappeared since 1700, with most being lost since 1900. This has become an issue for many reasons, not least resultant losses in biodiversity and livelihoods, the release of carbon into the atmosphere, and ruptures in cultural associations with specific wetlands. Within these changing landscapes, new kinds of wetland environments have also emerged with complex histories of their own, like sewage treatment works. The book focuses on particular wetland sites, including those that are recognised as internationally important under the Ramsar Convention, agricultural landscapes, one that includes sewage treatment works, and wetlands that have been drained. I particularly engage with wetlands that are located within the country of Ngarrindjeri, Girbal, Walwyn, and Wiradjuri Aboriginal people. Through these studies, I'm interested in asking what is counted as a wetland for whom and with what consequences? And how have the different interests of those who had a stake in these wetlands come together and shaped each other? And here I've been interested in areas of both conflict and cooperation. A key way I have approached the questions of what is a wetland and how have wetlands been understood and valued is by appreciating that these are always multi-species questions. Wetlands have always been shaped with and against other species, from weaving sedges to eradicating mosquitoes to saving water birds. Wetland environments in the Murray-Darling Basin and in Australia more generally need to be understood in the context of Aboriginal people's millennia-long history of living in and with these places. Aboriginal people have co-created diverse landscapes across the continent over tens of thousands of years, including many wetlands, for example, through burning and other agricultural, aquacultural, and spiritual practices. Paying attention to this co-creation disabuses us of notions that these wetlands are simply natural and thus, by definition, threatened by human activity. Instead, we need to acknowledge the vast array of potential interactions people can have with wetlands. British colonisation, beginning in the late 18th century, radically altered Aboriginal people's relationships with wetlands in this region. Perhaps most significantly, the approaches and forms of water management brought by British colonists later informed the construction of large dams and extensive irrigation networks by state, interstate, and federal government bureaucracies, particularly across the 20th century. Most histories related to water in the basin have focused on the lives of water engineers, the construction of water storage and diversion projects, and the role of water bureaucracies in manipulating water flow. These histories have been important in revealing some of the rationales behind and consequences of these schemes. Yet there were many other actors here too, including a diverse array of humans and other species that shape these histories. This book expands traditional narratives by highlighting the diversity of human and non-human agencies that have co-created wetlands. Examining non-human agencies further underscores the need for new narratives of colonisation in this region, showing how relationships among Aboriginal people, European settlers, and others were dynamically embedded within and shaped by wider, more than human relationships. In engaging with these approaches and arguments, this book aims to further develop emerging approaches to more than human histories. And I'll just talk a little about this approach. In 2010, I went into the archives looking for government documents on water use in commercial rice growing in New South Wales and Victoria, but I came out thinking about wetlands. In the context of an ongoing drought, I wanted to know more about the changing water politics of irrigation and rice. How had this water-intensive crop come to be grown and then to dominate agriculture in some areas, which had experienced long droughts before? As expected, I found large files on water and rice growing created by the state governments. What I had not expected was the almost equally large files on ducks in rice growing areas. I knew that the annual duck migrations that traverse the rice growing areas of California had proved challenging for managers there, but the Australian ducks were not migratory. They were instead nomadic, following the less predictable movements of water. In the Murrumbidgee irrigation area in New South Wales, these ducks presented some unique challenges for managers, farmers, and scientists. For many farmers, a range of different species of ducks had become pests soon after they started growing rice there in the 1920s. These birds damaged rice crops when they settled in paddies and ate freshly sown rice. But for the ducks, the flooded rice paddies were additional watery, grassy places to swim and forage, sometimes replacing other wetland habitat as farmers diverted water for this farming. In this way, the flooded rice paddies became a kind of wetland, with not only ducks and rice, but a range of other plants, frogs, birds, and insects moving into them. Some farmers welcomed some of these new arrivals, others not. Much depended on the farmer. As I entered further into the duck stories, they offered a different view of the history of rice growing, water, and wetlands, one that gave insight into their needs and values, as well as their influence on a range of human concerns. Further, their movement and attraction to water seemed to contest the human boundaries between agricultural lands and natural areas. Ultimately, the ducks started to change my sense of who the important actors were in this history and just how much control humans had over the histories they tried to make. More than human approaches help us understand these sort of socio-ecological relationships. These approaches have developed over the last 2 decades through a transdisciplinary dialogue among science and technology studies, anthropology, geography, philosophy, and other fields. This dialogue has shaped an interdisciplinary set of concerns that have come to sit within the environmental humanities. In general terms, this scholarship rejects notions of human exceptionalism that, in Western traditions, have helped separate nature from culture and justify human exploitation of an externalized nature. Instead, it argues for richer examinations of socio-ecological relationships that more fully account for diversity of actors, both human and non-human. Crucially, these approaches emphasize the importance of situating shifting modes of understanding that have been used to make sense of and inhabit these relationships. These modes of understanding, including those in the sciences, have been formed within specific histories, cultures, and more than human relationships, and have had particular consequences. In many ways, environmental historians have shared these concerns. Environmental history is an established field that emerged in the 1970s and has since sought to interrogate changing human relationships with the environment. Indeed, historians have sought to show the dynamic roles of other organisms, from Alfred Crosby's ecological imperialism to Harriet Ritvo's work on animals in Victorian England, and the contributors to a recent collection titled The Historical Animal, who argue for the importance of taking animal perspectives and behaviours seriously, including in the making of films. However, these works have not always explicitly aimed to contribute to multi-species and more than human scholarship. While environmental historians are increasingly identifying with the environmental humanities and the field, the field has largely treated this as an umbrella rather than an interdisciplinary space that it too can transform and also be transformed by. There is, however, a growing body of historical scholarship that is explicitly engaging with these multi-species and more than human approaches to examine the agency of other biota in shaping human histories, while also being attentive to shifting and diverse ways of knowing human and beyond. These more than human histories show that both environmental history and more than human approaches are needed to more fully account for the diversity of humans and non-humans that have shaped socio-ecological relationships and how these relationships have shifted over time. More than human histories are always situated and partial and necessarily run counter to overarching grand narratives. In engaging with particular sets of more than human relationships and situated knowledges, these kind of approaches emphasize diversity and multiplicity in many forms. In this way, they work to avoid homogenizing and universalizing the human, to pay close attention to differences in human experiences, even as they aim to rethink and reposition human lives within the context of multi-species entanglements. Questions of race and gender are deeply entangled in multi-species worlds. This book aims to be attentive to these relationships and to draw attention to both human and non-human diversity. Attending to multiple ways of interacting with and understanding wetlands opens up not only new histories, but also futures for these places, histories and futures that might better account for and even promote this diversity. Each chapter of Wetlands in a Dryland centres on a key theme that illuminates an important aspect of the history of wetlands in the Murray-Darling Basin and beyond. And these themes are weaving, leaking, crossing, enclosing, migrating, and rippling. These are themes that highlight relationships, socio-ecological entanglements of humans and non-humans, many of which take place across and complicate Western modernist human borders. These accounts draw on original archival research as well as oral histories and interviews, alongside time spent in these places. In each case, I've sought to read and listen for multiple agencies. While many of the chapters focus on specific animals and plants, from sedges to mosquitoes, seals, ducks, and pelicans, these discussions are situated within a bigger cast of organisms and forces to show the multiple more than human relationships at stake. The chapter's thematic focus, or the thematic focus of the chapters rather, aims to bring together past and more recent events, policies, and interactions. The book begins with contemporary concerns in order to foreground the pressing issues that Aboriginal people, particularly women, grapple with as they seek to create a healthier country amid multiple pressures and historical legacies. By focusing on weaving, this first chapter shows that the concerns of Welwen and other Aboriginal groups, concerns that may seem disparate to others, are in fact intimately connected. It aims to provide a complex, richly woven understanding of what is at stake in the lack of water in wetlands. Weaving interconnects generations and wetland sites, water politics, and access to these cultural landscapes. The remaining chapters are roughly chronological, focusing on successive events and particular sites that are important in understanding the history of wetlands in this region and elsewhere, where they move back and forth between the past and the present. Through these chapters, Wetlands in a Dry Land seeks to show that far from being static or pristine nature, wetlands are places of multifaceted human and non-human encounter. Wetlands are sites in which issues of race, class, and gender have taken and continue to take shape within dynamic sets of human and non-human relationships. Managing wetlands as cultural spaces with lively human and more than human histories and futures would look very different to most current models. Indeed, doing so could lead to more socially just and sustainable models. Further, through history, we can appreciate that wetland animals and plants have responded differently to varied pressures. Their dynamic lives and behaviours means that they often move across and between wetland, agricultural, urban and wider landscapes in ways that need to be better accounted for by managers, farmers and others. We need to keep revising the meanings and values we associate with watery places and the category of wetlands as these continue to inform their management. Australian perspectives on uncertain water and climate regimes are important contributions to global discussions as we enter an era shaped by changing climate regimes and by the responses of dynamic human and non-human agents. We need imaginative responses now more than ever. Ultimately, this book tries to widen the scope for reimagining wetlands and indeed dominant modes of water management as these places continue to be lost, undertaking a multi-scale and more than human history, showing the way they have been shaped with and against other species. People's understandings of wetlands matter. This history shows that shifts in these understandings and relationships is possible. Things might be different. For the rest of this talk, I'd like to focus on one specific set of issues and events from this book. It's a little less grounded than what I've been talking about so far, or differently grounded, rather, to the rest of the book. This focuses on the category of wetlands itself. Engaging with Australian federal government archives from the early 1970s, this remaining part of the paper offers a fairly narrow but important episode, I think, in a history of wetlands, focusing on a key set of years when wetlands was new terminology in the language of conservation. While I'm more used to writing and talking about archives grounded in particular watery places, I've come to appreciate that some of the critical sites in a history of wetlands are boardrooms and government buildings. The decisions and disagreements of bureaucrats and scientists in Australia and elsewhere in this period about what counted as a wetland and why have had long-lasting and mixed consequences. While we might think of the category of wetlands as natural and value neutral, it is not. It is historical and it has been shaped by specific sets of values. In his study of forests of Canada's west coast, Bruce Braun has argued that something called a forest, far from being self-evident and in a space outside of politics, enters history. Like forests, wetlands have been made visible. While the term wetlands was used before the 1960s, it was not common. In the 1960s and 1970s, wetlands had a historical moment of sorts. They entered history internationally as a category and object of conservation. So here I'll focus on two key factors that together shape the emergence of the category of wetlands as an object of conservation in this period, in the 60s and 70s, and that are important in a history of wetlands more generally. Multiscalar politics and bird centrism. Each of these have had particular stakes, creating lasting tensions within wetlands conservation and management. In this period in Australia, a national environment movement, Pacific diplomacy and scientists' concerns over species and habitat loss, which were shared more widely, converged to shape the Australian government's involvement in the Ramsar Convention on Wetlands of International Importance and simultaneously a Japan-Australia Migratory Bird Agreement. These two international agreements need to be understood as connected, as the Australian government sought to shore up the conservation of migratory birds and their watery habitat together, and at the same time enhance its influence over conservation matters within the states. Government conservation departments leveraged these agreements jointly to initiate a nationwide wetland survey, which was ultimately abandoned for multiple reasons, including disagreements over whether wetlands were primarily an object of conservation as waterbird habitat or for a range of other uses and values. So I just want to unpack this history a little bit because it's quite a narrow set of years and a narrow episode in the history of wetlands, but it has huge ramifications for how wetlands are understood and managed today. Australian representatives had not been centrally involved in the conception or drafting of the Ramsar Convention. Yet Australia became one of the first nations to sign the convention in 1972 and was the first full member nation in 1974. Further, Japan, not Australia, initiated a migratory bird agreement between the two countries in 1972. Yet Australian officials eagerly accepted the proposal, with the final text being signed in 1974. The involvement of the Australian government in both the Ramsar Convention and the Japan Agreement needs to be understood within the context of a growing national environment movement, which reacted against the environmental effects of post- and Cold War national development projects, including intensified land settlement supported by more dams and irrigation, changes in industrialised farming, wetlands drainage, and the severance of floodplains from rivers through extensive mitigation measures. Within this context, the national election saw a new Labor government led by Gough Whitlam elected in December 1972. The Whitlam government soon began to seek greater involvement for the Australian government in environmental matters and created a new Department of the Environment and Conservation. Just 2 months before the Whitlam government was elected, the Australian House of Representatives released a report from an inquiry into wildlife conservation. Birds with international migration routes featured in the report, which recommended that Australia seek international cooperation for their protection. It argued that this was part of Australia's international responsibility to ensure not only that action is being taken in this country, but also to demonstrate our concern internationally through the establishment of agreements with other countries. In a section on wetlands and swamps, the report stated, "It is generally agreed that waterfowl are declining in numbers as a result of the encroachment of agriculture and resultant drainage of swampland, the damming of rivers, flood mitigation programs, and the trampling by stock and feral animals of nesting cover on the edge of lagoons." Notably, the report used the new international conservation term, wetlands. The rise and popularisation of wetlands as a term and as a category and object of conservation around the world was significantly influenced by a series of international discussions and research projects on migratory waterbird conservation from the early 1960s, which resulted in the Ramsar Convention. The focus of the planned convention became wetlands habitat rather than migratory birds in 1965, largely due to a sense amongst participating countries that it would be too slow and difficult to secure agreement and ratification from so many countries on a migratory bird convention, and agreement on habitat protection would be easier. As historian Robert Boardman has noted, of the conventions of the period, this came the closest to being a bird convention. The bias towards birds has remained in the Ramsar Convention. In fact, the original title, Wetlands of International Importance, especially as waterfowl habitat, remains the same in the latest version of the agreement, although this last part has been dropped everywhere else in Ramsar's public profile. This bias has also remained in wetlands management and conservation, which has meant that other, less charismatic species have at times been overlooked. However, that the Ramsar Convention became a habitat convention has meant that it has been able to be used at times for a range of other purposes, like the protection of crocodiles in parts of Australia and South Africa. The Ramsar Convention emerged within the context of a growing global sense of an environmental crisis, a widespread recognition that many issues, from the protection of migratory birds to nuclear waste and air pollution, needed global cooperation. Michael Soule has argued that conservation science, which championed biodiversity, emerged in this era as a crisis discipline that responded to the sense that there needed to be immediate action on pressing problems of species loss and environmental destruction. So too did the conservation science subfield of wetlands ecology, which emerged out of a sense of crisis in reductions of species-rich watery places linked to shrinking numbers of water birds, something that had already been noted in the USA and Europe for several decades. In the 1960s, wetlands began to be used as an international lingua franca of sorts by scientists, but served as an umbrella word for a range of local terms, like swamps, marshes, and in Australia, billabongs. It also served to repackage these places, which had commonly been associated in the West with disease, death, waste, and the underworld, and it repackaged these as places worth protecting, particularly as migratory bird habitat. Wetlands were therefore constituted with their re-evaluation. The Ramsar Convention took the broadest possible definition of wetlands so as to encompass local diversity in how this term might be applied. And this definition included areas of marsh, fen, peatland, or water, whether natural or artificial, permanent or temporary, with water that is static or flowing, fresh, brackish, or salt, including areas of marine water, the depth of which at low tide does not exceed 6 metres. Within this definition, coral reefs could be included as wetlands, something that wetland ecologists still take issue with, and the Ramsar definition remains contested. The Ramsar Convention has become known as the first modern environmental convention, as it aimed to protect habitat rather than regulate hunting, and reflected the ethos of the emergent environment movement. Yet Ramsar's focus on water birds and its processes for protection, essentially the establishment of a list of internationally important sites by participating countries, which were then obliged to establish protected areas, can also be seen as carrying forward ornithologists and hunters' interests in the West that had traditionally dominated the protection of these birds and their habitats as game reserves, and that was to maintain populations, hunting populations. Despite its emphasis on the wise use of wetlands, Ramsar's focus on establishing protected areas also helped to carry forward the colonising tendencies of this mode of environmental protection in settler societies like Australia and the USA. In Australia, by the 1970s, protected areas were associated with an idea of wilderness as an externalised nature, devoid of human activity and history, which served to erase past and ongoing connections of Aboriginal people. While area protection, including of watery sites, has a long history in many places, as various countries signed and ratified the Ramsar Convention, wetlands were made visible as objects of conservation in new ways, with specific legal, bureaucratic, economic, and political associations. These were, in turn, refigured by local ecologies, histories, expertise, politics, and ways of life. So back to Australia. Soon after the creation of the Department of the Environment and Conservation, the Minister, Moss Cass, started the process of Australia becoming a full party to the Ramsar Convention and wrote to the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, requesting information on other international agreements to which Australia could become party. The Whitlam government was deliberately shoring up the federal government's ability to use an external affairs power. This power, which was in the Australian Constitution, made it possible for the federal government to become involved in state matters if these lay within the terms of international agreements. Australia's participation in both Ramsar and a migratory bird treaty with Japan was linked to this strategy, which became so prominent that the Attorney General warned that it could affect the functioning of the government. However, the practical use of the external affairs power remained contested in these years. Japan approached Australia about forming a migratory bird treaty in 1972. Japan sought to make a number of similar agreements, including with the USA and USSR, as it was then, as steps towards possible pan-Pacific migratory bird protection, or even a global convention on migratory birds. For all of the countries involved, migratory bird agreements were tools of diplomacy in the Pacific at a time when Cold War tensions were still high. The migratory bird agreements also reflected genuine concern over the need for greater cooperation in conservation efforts. In Japan and Australia, there was widespread concern over decreases in bird numbers and extinctions, with collaborations between scientists on particular species like Latham snipe already emerging. The agreement aimed to facilitate exchanges and information between scientists and the establishment of bird banding programs. It also required a shared commitment from the national governments to protect listed species of birds and their habitats, including through protected areas. For some government scientists, Australia's involvement in the Ramsar Convention and a migratory bird treaty with Japan highlighted a paucity of knowledge about what now might be classified as wetlands on a national scale. Individual studies showed that there had been a loss of important water bird habitat in specific places, such as a 1970 study, which indicated that 60% of wetlands along coastal New South Wales had been destroyed or degraded, largely due to drainage for flood mitigation. Yet any effort to quantify losses more widely was difficult, perhaps amplified by the fact that wetlands themselves were only just being made visible as objects of scientific study. In 1972, members of an Australian Committee on Water Birds, made up of state and federal government researchers and managers, proposed a national wetland survey focused on water bird habitat in order to support Australia's obligations to both the Ramsar Convention and the Japan Agreement. In an interdepartmental meeting, the chief of the Wildlife Division of CSIRO, the Commonwealth Science and Industrial Research Organisation, Harry Frith, drew attention to the links between wetland habitat and that of migratory birds, stating that of about 69 species of birds involved in migrations between Asia and Australia, approximately 50 are dependent on wetland habitats. The proposal for a survey of wetland habitats of Australian water birds was approved, but then a Council of Nature Conservation Ministers significantly widened the brief to go beyond an examination of water bird habitat and encompass all wetland areas so as to be beneficial to a wider section of government agencies. Ultimately, 3 CSIRO research divisions became involved in undertaking essentially separate investigations as to whether such a survey was feasible. These were wildlife, land use, and fisheries and oceanography. Notably, the Australian government researchers did not use the Ramsar definition of wetlands as they sought to reflect Australian ecologies and concerns within the international frameworks. The bird-centred proposal had used a definition of wetlands that focused on their role as wetlands' role as bird habitat. When the brief expanded and 3 divisions became involved, these divisions needed to formulate a broader definition, and this was contested between them. Each of the feasibility studies soon ran into problems. The Division of Wildlife Research aimed to test methodologies for classifying wetlands according to the needs of water birds, assessing fauna diversity or richness, and assessing populations of water birds. It focused on 6 sites, all in New South Wales. While they had some success at these sites, this study threw into question the practicality of undertaking a continent-wide survey. The diversity of bird species and different and changing habitat needs made implementing a single methodology too difficult, and constraints of budget and people power meant that comprehensive data simply could not be gathered. The division's report concluded that a national survey might not be the most important step to take next in water birds conservation, What was needed was rather detailed ecological research. Further, the chief of the division admitted that while ephemeral wetlands in Australia were important for their opportunistic use by water birds, no one has yet been able to properly assess them. At present, we have no idea how we will overcome that problem when the survey begins. Dynamic wetlands in an arid continent proved a challenge for any simple process of quantification. The other divisions ran into similar problems. Further, the wetlands survey was being pulled in different directions by the CSIRO divisions and towards essentially 3 different wetlands. Wetlands for birds, wetlands as hydrological entities, and wetlands as fisheries and estuaries. The 3 divisions, each seeing major issues with beginning a national wetland survey, requested more funds and time for pilot studies, which would inform a wetland survey proper, with an estimated cost of $3.3 million over 8 years. No more funding was granted, and the wetland survey was labelled not essential by the government. In 1979, the acting Minister of Environment and Science stated that the wetland survey was not implemented because of cost, lack of agreement on a national approach, and differences of opinion on the extent to which a national survey should concentrate on the aquatic fauna or the total wetlands ecosystem. The survey had ultimately become unworkable. That the survey did not or could not go ahead has had a range of implications. Perhaps most significantly, wetlands ecologists have limited ability to give robust estimates of losses of wetlands. As recently noted by wetlands ecologists, an understanding of the distribution and extent of wetlands is critical for effective management and policy, but remains a knowledge barrier across Australia. Currently, information on wetlands is compiled from patchy state and territory summaries, with only 2 states undertaking reasonable monitoring, but using different methodologies. This means that there is no contemporary national map of wetlands distribution and extent. The only consistent national wetlands database remains a narrow data set from the 1960s that is plagued by a range of problems, in the words of wetlands ecologists, including inconsistent attribution of types of wetlands and inability to account for ephemeral wetlands. Instead, a case-by-case and typology approach to wetlands conservation has unfolded, focusing on important or iconic sites that have reasonable historical research behind them. Birds have remained central to wetlands conservation, management, and sciences. For example, the health of these places in Eastern Australia is reviewed each year by wetlands ecologists through an aerial bird survey, which also monitors numbers of threatened and migratory birds. While birds are treated as indicators of the general condition of wetlands, the view of wetlands that these surveys produce are necessarily the view of birds and not those of other biota. Further, while biodiversity is given increasing emphasis in wetlands management, this at times amounts to diversity of different bird species. Historian Libby Robin has argued that birds will continue to be important in environmental conservation and management in Australia, partly for historical reasons, as there has simply been so much research on them in the past that comparisons across time are better founded than for most other animals and plants. So just to wrap up here, wetlands entered history in this period, gathering specific sets of values, expertise, and politics shaped by multi-scalar politics and bird centrism, and deeply connected to Australasian and Pacific circulations, both human and more than human. This history has had significant and mixed consequences for the way wetlands are understood and managed within conservation science and governments today. This is a category that we need to keep revisiting and refining, asking what counts as a wetland for whom and with what consequences. Thank you.
Emily, thank you so very much. What an extraordinary piece of work that this has been. I have several things that I want to know myself, but I will share the question asking with others. I believe that you can enter questions in the chat and I should be able to see them. But to start off, I guess when most people think about wetlands and conservation and things, they're often thinking about some sort of return to an original or natural state. Can you talk a bit about where the baseline is, or in some of the stories that you've told?
Sure. So I look specifically at historical baselines, which are really important in wetlands and management and environmental management more broadly. They're quite an interesting concept, historical baselines, and it's something that historians have become increasingly interested in themselves, because they function in quite interesting ways in the present, but also it's quite an interesting understanding of history. So this is sort of a topic that historians have become more and more interested in themselves. And it's a concept I look at specifically in the last chapter of the book, which focuses on the Coorong Lagoon in South Australia, right at the end of the Murray-Darling system, right where it's about to go into the mouth of the Murray, or the freshwater go through the mouth of the Murray, hopefully, and into the ocean. So in that area, there have been seal populations, long-nosed fur seals, who have rebounded in numbers in recent years. So their numbers were reduced significantly in the sealing era, in the late 1700s and then into the early 1800s, almost to extinction. A lot of seal and sea lion populations were quite reduced, and they sort of only survived in hard to reach areas where the sealers couldn't really get to them. And they have been protected in the 20th century, and their numbers have rebounded. It's a bit unclear why, but one reason might be that, but through that protection, so they're not being killed as much by people, and their numbers are rebounding, or some of their numbers, like the long-nosed fur seals. But the long-nosed fur seals are quite interesting because they've now become a pest in this wetland in the Coorong, where there's a fishing industry, a very lively fishing industry, and the seals are moving into the lagoon and taking fish from fishers' nets. They are reducing the hauls, they're causing massive damage to the fishing nets and so on. And they're also injuring wildlife in various ways. And the fishers and also local Ngarrindjeri Aboriginal people are arguing that the seals were never here before. This is new territory for the seals. They don't have a history of being here. But within scientific management, there's an understanding that as the seals rebound, they reoccupy their former ranges. But the evidence from where the seals were, particularly at the time of sealing, so the idea is that the seals are reoccupying their former ranges as they were at the time of sealing. So that's the historical baseline. But the historical evidence for where the seals were is really patchy. So part of the characteristic aspects of sealing is that there were very few records. People involved in the sealing industry were at times trying to not be visible. They didn't want people to know what they were doing or where they were. And the accounting for seal pelts and so on was very broad. So it was like, this many brown pelts or whatever. So it was more about the quality of the pelts than who the seals were or where they were that was being recorded. So there's a lot of historical gaps. The records are very patchy, but from these are the basis of the baseline. So it's a very difficult concept to feel confident about, particularly when others have, like oral histories from Ngarrindjeri people are saying that the seals weren't here. So it's a very contested concept, and as we know as historians, historical records are really just what survives. There's often a lot of gaps. So yeah, the idea of historical baselines is fascinating in a range of ways, but it does have problems, particularly in terms of historical evidence, which is one of the
And I guess then what the implications of that historical, so in some ways what's being contested is not just what's the original, but what is being destroyed. Is destruction the right word? It was what should be saved, what should be, how should this be managed in some way? What's likely to happen in the Coorong?
Well, it's a sort of ongoing, it's an ongoing conversation that's still happening now. So the seals are continuing to be a problem in the Coorong for fishers, and Ngarrindjeri people continue to say that the seals are injuring wildlife that are important in kinship relationships. It's been a really contentious issue. The fishing industry is already under a lot of strain because of various other changes on the Coorong, and this was another thing. Nets are really expensive, and it's actually a lot of financial pressure. So they are pretty vocal about this. But the seals are protected, and the state government is pretty adamant about those protections as well. So there have been other options that have been trialled. So things like scaring seals away. So there's techniques about using firecrackers and all this sort of stuff, but they're not working that well. The seals get used to them, and one of the things I find fascinating about the seals is that through their behaviours and talking to fishers about the seals, there's a real sense that these are dynamic animals. Like, they are figuring stuff out. They're moving into the Coorong because people just aren't a threat anymore. The fishers can't do anything about it, and the fishers say the seals, no, we can't do anything. So they come into the boats and so on. So yeah, it's quite interesting. They're quite dynamic animals, and they're responding to changing human behaviours. They're protected now. So yeah, they can do a lot. They can do a lot.
It's fascinating.
Yeah.
Look, let me go to have a look at some of these questions that have been coming in for a little bit. So Sonia Catley asks about whether man-made wetlands function differently to natural wetlands.
Yeah, it's a really good question. So I guess there's a couple of different threads there. So human-made wetlands like sewage treatment plants have become Ramsar listed. So there's some outside of Melbourne, I think it's Werribee, that are Ramsar listed because the sewage is so nutrient rich that the frogs thrive, and then the birds come, and it's a great spot for birds. And yeah, there are farmers who try and create wildlife-friendly farm dams, and there's also, I have talked to rice farmers as well in the Murrumbidgee irrigation area who are managing their rice farms as a sort of wetlands. So the birds come and eat the bugs and so on. So it's sort of a working with the birds. And other sites like the Macquarie Marshes, beautiful Ramsar listed site that we might think of as natural, also has these deep cultural layers to it. So when people have been burning that wetland for tens of thousands of years, and it's got quite a lot of management scaffolding around it, as well as a Ramsar site, like a government scaffolding around it. So I mean, it's interesting. I would say that there's similarities, and I sort of resist that sharp distinction between natural and human-made. But that said, I think there is a danger of just saying, why don't we just have all the sewage treatment plants as Ramsar sites, and then we can divert all the water from the Macquarie Marshes, because of these deep cultural connections as well as deep ecological connections. So the particular animals and plants have evolved within those particular wetlands to live with those particular wetland regimes. So I think it's a really good question. It's a really tricky one. I
guess that what's interesting in your approach that I think kind of reminds me of E.P. Thompson's making of the working, kind of where it's the making of the wetlands through the different interactions, and so that humans are always involved in different times in the making of wetlands, even when they're not necessarily man-made. I think that this is kind of the great strength of your extraordinary work. I'm going to skip over a comment to land on Richard White via Catherine Bishop's account. Says, thanks, Emily, great stuff. Could you say more about the politics of those 1970s conventions? How much agreement or disagreement was there across party politics?
Thanks, Richard. I'm laughing because they're like, many people know much more about the politics of this period than myself, and into the 80s as well, which was an intense period of environmental politics that caused huge divisions between parties, of course, and that varied between federal and state levels as well. But yeah, I would say so that the wildlife report that I put the little picture up of was included people from across party lines. But the part of this period going into the 80s is, of course, like the Franklin River case, the Lake Pedder and Franklin River case, particularly, which goes, of course, famously to the High Court, the Franklin River case. And the federal government intervenes based on an external affairs power, a World Heritage external affairs power. So I feel like I don't have all the knowledge at my fingertips to answer this question fully, but I think it's a really interesting period where there are these sharp party lines. And of course, changes in government happen over environmental politics in this period in really profound ways. So yeah, there are lines, a lot of lines being drawn in the sand. And part of the really interesting dynamics of this period, I think, is the federal state dynamics, where the federal government is starting to find ways to intervene in state matters. So I know that's probably unsatisfactory, but I'll stop there.
Well, someone calling themselves Roto Secretary is saying, thank you from Gundungurra country. Question, what was the importance of the Murray-Darling Royal Commission in 1904?
Ooh.
Now, I feel like this is a quiz question.
Oh my gosh. So now, this is something I have covered so I've got another book on the Murray-Darling Basin, which is called Flood Country, where I deal more with some of the formation of the bureaucracies around the basin. So my understanding is that it was a Murray River Commission in 1904, which was centred on the Murray River, and it was really about the shared state interest in the Murray River. So it was Victoria, New South Wales and South Australia. And then my understanding is that out of that, it forms there's a new bureaucratic structure that's formed called the Murray River Commission, which is really centred on the Murray River, and that it's only much later that Queensland becomes involved and the Darling River becomes central to that sort of river system-based agreements. So that is really digging deep into the memory archives, and I apologise.
Well done. It's very impressive. The same person is asking about how many categories of wetlands and swamps there are. I guess this seems like an opportunity too to think about the ways that the swamp has been kind of seen to be a place of disease and of, a thing that should be drained, both metaphorically and often literally. I guess where do things like the endangered Upper Mountains hanging swamps fit? But what are the swamps we want to protect? What are the swamps we want to drain? How do we understand those different kinds of categories?
Yeah, there are a lot of different kinds of categories. So there's this big term wetlands, but within that there are still these nuances, of course. And we still use terms like swamps and marshes, and the upper mountains hanging swamps are just beautiful, and they've got strong advocates behind them, which is really wonderful. So it depends. I think it depends at what level you're looking at too. So there's different categories within the Ramsar Convention. So there's like a whole matrix that you can fill out for the Ramsar Convention to determine particular characteristics of the wetlands and so on. But then, as you pointed out, Hannah, there is this, how do we characterize swamps in ways that make them valuable or able to be disregarded, which I think is really important. And so, yeah, I think there is this, as I touched on in my talk, there is this sort of rebranding exercise around wetlands as places where we're saving, and they're value laden. It's a value laden term, so calling something a wetland rather than a swamp or a pond or something like that, it carries a different sort of set of values. Yeah.
Do we still think swamps cause disease? Do they cause disease?
Well, yeah. Sorry, I was just thinking, so the Blue Mountains, the Upper Mountains hanging swamps are quite interesting there, because you keep that, the swamp terminology, but it's gathered this protection ethos behind it. So it does have strong advocates behind it, and it's almost like been reclaimed as a terminology for those swamps. So it is quite an interesting case. I'll have to think more about the Upper Blue Mountains hanging swamps. And sorry, you had asked me something else.
I was wondering, do swamps actually cause us disease? Should we? What?
Yeah, they're really interesting. The changing understandings of swamps as places of disease are just fascinating. So they have been for a long time associated with disease, particularly so in the 1800s, 19th century. One of the dominant theories of disease was miasmatic theory, where
Is that where? So it's things floating in the air that causes disease.
Yeah, odors.
Is that? Yeah.
Specifically, yeah. So and swamps and wetlands or swamps as they were called, there, marshes as stinky places. There's an idea that stink was about disease. And then at the end of the 1800s into the early 1900s, there was more scientific research happening on things like malaria, which had been attributed to miasma. But there was a lot of work going on mosquitoes as possible vectors of disease. And so that life cycle of the malaria parasite was proven by scientists in the late 1800s, early 1900s. And so then mosquitoes were sort of targeted as vectors of disease in a new way with vigor, with gusto. And so oiling swamps became a thing to stop the mosquitoes breeding, and spraying with DDT at different times in the 40s, a bit later on. And there was fears that returned soldiers in World War I and II would bring the mosquito-borne diseases into Australia in their blood, that they'd been infected overseas, and that then the mosquitoes here would transfer them to others. So I mean, swamps are interesting. So some mosquitoes like swamps more than others. Some mosquitoes, like Anopheles mosquitoes, which spread things like malaria like small pools, but some others like swamps, and some that spread disease, other diseases that are more common in Australia, like swamps. But we have had cases of malaria in Australia, locally. Locally transferred cases, but it's not. It hasn't been common for a long time. Yeah, I think many of our mosquitoes aren't very good vectors. Anopheles mosquitoes are not, very efficient at transferring malaria.
Well, let's hope they stay that way, I suppose. One last kind of quite thorny question, which is about what is your opinion on water rights being treated as an internationally tradable commodity? I think we could call this liquid assets.
It's a really good question. And there's someone who's written a really good recent book about it. gave a talk on Late Night Live, Radio National, about exactly this topic. And they had a really interesting take on it. Particularly, trading and some of the issues with water trading schemes, which sort of trade on futures. And in Australia, that is very difficult thing to do, where we've got these periods of dry and wet. So I suppose I'm not a fan in many ways. I think separation from water and land has caused a lot of problems in Australia.
Yeah. Look, I think further research is required, I suspect, but seems like quantifying such things is altogether a problem. Well, look, thank you so much, Emily. We might finish it up at the 5 o'clock mark, and I'm so grateful for all the talk that you've given today. Everybody, please remember that look at this beautiful cover. Such a wonderful book, totally worth a read. Have a look at the University of Washington Press website. The link is in the chat, and you can purchase it through there. You might even, if you know Emily, you might be able to ask her if she has some copies that you could buy from her directly as well. Yeah. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
We'll see you next